The smell of cordite and wet stone hung in the morning air like a funeral shroud as Corporal Harlan Wyeth pressed himself against the broken wall of what had once been a farmhouse somewhere in the Apennine Mountains of northern Italy. It was November 7th, 1944, and the rain had finally stopped after 3 days of relentless downpour, leaving everything slick and gray under a sky the color of old pewter. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the bone-deep cold that had seeped into every soldier during the night, as he pulled the small mirror fragment from his breast pocket. The piece of glass was no larger than a playing card, scavenged from a shattered bathroom in Bologna 3 weeks earlier, when most men were looking for food or ammunition or dry socks. The men in his platoon thought he was crazy. His commanding officer had explicitly forbidden what he was about to do, calling it reckless and unauthorized, a complete waste of time that violated every standard operating procedure for reconnaissance that the United States Army had developed over 3 years of brutal warfare. But Harlan had watched 17 men die in the past 9 days to German snipers hidden in these godless mountains. 17 letters home to mothers and wives and sweethearts who would never fully understand why their boys had to die. He knew with absolute certainty that following the rules meant more body bags, more telegrams, more families destroyed because doctrine said you had to expose yourself to find the enemy. He angled the mirror slowly toward the ridgeline 300 yards north, his movements so gradual they were almost invisible, catching just enough morning light to reflect off the glass without creating an obvious glare that would give away his position. And in that instant, in that single fraction of a second, he saw it. The glint he had been hunting for since dawn, the telltale reflection of German optics scanning the valley floor where American soldiers would soon be moving through on their way to the next objective. His heart hammered against his ribs as he calculated the angle, the distance, the wind that whispered through the shattered olive trees. This was it, the moment where he would either prove his theory or get court-martialed for disobeying a direct order. No one in the 3rd Infantry Division knew that one man's defiance that morning, armed with nothing but a ranch hand's understanding of light and reflection, would revolutionize counter-sniper tactics and make him 5 times more deadly than the enemy marksman who had terrorized these mountains for months. Harlan Wyeth had never imagined himself as a soldier. He had grown up on a cattle ranch outside Sheridan, Wyoming, where the wind came hard off the Bighorn Mountains, and a man learned to read the land the way city people read newspapers. His father, Gideon Wyeth, had taught him everything worth knowing about working cattle, mending fence line that stretched for miles across high plains, and surviving in country where nature did not forgive mistakes. Harlan had learned to spot coyotes on distant ridges by watching for the glint of their eyes at dawn, that specific reflection that meant predator rather than deer or antelope. He had learned to locate lost cattle in heavy brush by using a mirror to flash sunlight into hidden draws and watching for movement in response, the animals shifting position when light hit them unexpectedly. He had learned patience, the kind that came from spending 10 hours in a saddle waiting for the right moment to move a stubborn steer, and he had learned to improvise solutions with whatever materials were at hand because the nearest hardware store was 40 miles away. These were not skills the Army valued or even recognized, not things that showed up on aptitude tests or training evaluations, but they were the skills that would save lives in ways no one could have predicted. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Harlan was 22 years old and had never been farther from Wyoming than Billings, Montana. He enlisted in January of 1942, not out of burning patriotic fervor, but because it seemed like the right thing to do, the way helping a neighbor with a barn raising was the right thing to do. His mother cried when he left. His father shook his hand and told him to keep his head down, advice that made more sense in movies than in modern warfare. Basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, had been a revelation in all the wrong ways. Harlan discovered that the Army had very specific ideas about how things should be done, and those ideas rarely accounted for individual initiative or creative problem-solving. He clashed repeatedly with drill instructors who could not understand why this lanky ranch hand from Wyoming kept suggesting alternative methods for reconnaissance or questioning the logic of frontal assaults when flanking maneuvers seemed more practical. He was not insubordinate exactly, but he had a stubborn streak that came from years of making decisions alone on the range where the wrong choice meant dead cattle or a broken leg miles from help. His marksmanship scores were excellent among the top 10% of his training class. His physical conditioning was superb from years of ranch work, but his evaluations noted a troubling tendency toward independent thinking. One instructor wrote that Harlan Wyeth had the potential to be either an outstanding soldier or a catastrophic liability, depending on whether he learned to follow orders without modification. The Army assigned him to the 3rd Infantry Division as a rifleman. He shipped out to North Africa in November of 1942, part of Operation Torch, and saw his first combat outside Casablanca, where American forces were learning the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. Harlan distinguished himself during the Tunisia campaign through an almost preternatural ability to spot enemy positions before anyone else in his squad, a skill he attributed to years of scanning Wyoming horizons for predators and strays. His squad mates began to trust his instincts, even when they could not understand them. By the time the division invaded Sicily in July of 1943, Harlan had earned a reputation as someone who could keep you alive if you were smart enough to listen to him. The Italian campaign that began in September of 1943 was supposed to be the Allies' gateway to Europe. Instead, it became a grinding, bloody stalemate in some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The Germans had established defensive positions across the Italian peninsula, taking advantage of mountains and rivers and ancient stonework to create killing fields. By the autumn of 1944, the 3rd Infantry Division was fighting its way through the northern Apennines toward the Gothic Line. The terrain itself was a weapon: steep ridges, narrow valleys, villages built on hilltops, all of it favoring defenders who could see attackers coming from miles away. The weather had turned cold and wet, making every movement miserable. Supply lines were stretched thin, ammunition was rationed, and morale was sustained only by grim determination. The Germans defending the Gothic Line were experienced, disciplined, and expertly positioned. Their snipers were particularly effective. German sniper doctrine was built on lessons learned across multiple fronts. Their marksmen worked in pairs using high-quality Zeiss and Leica optics and carefully selected positions that offered both concealment and fields of fire. They were patient, disciplined, and deadly. An American infantry company advancing through a mountain valley might lose 3 or 4 men to sniper fire before anyone even saw muzzle flash. By November of 1944, Harlan's regiment had been fighting in the mountains for 6 weeks and had advanced less than 15 miles at a cost of over 300 casualties. 17 of those in Harlan's company alone had been from sniper fire, men who had survived North Africa and Sicily only to die from a bullet fired by someone they never saw. Standard American counter-sniper tactics involved either calling in artillery to saturate suspected sniper positions, which was effective but ammunition-intensive, or sending out scout patrols to try to locate the sniper, which often resulted in more casualties. American Army doctrine emphasized combined arms and firepower, not the patient hunting that effective counter-sniper work required. American snipers were expected to engage targets while the infantry advanced, not to conduct the methodical stalking that German snipers had perfected. The result was that German snipers operated with near impunity in the mountains, disrupting operations and inflicting casualties far out of proportion to their numbers. Intelligence estimated that fewer than 50 German snipers were operating across the division sector, but they were creating problems that affected thousands of soldiers. Harlan had watched this pattern repeat day after day, seeing friends die because doctrine had no good answer to an enemy who refused to fight conventionally. He had tried explaining his ideas to his platoon sergeant, Vincent Kowalski, a career soldier from Philadelphia, who had survived Anzio and had little patience for improvisation. Kowalski told him to shut up and follow orders. But Harlan had seen those tactics fail repeatedly, and he knew there had to be a better way. The breaking point came on November 3, 1944. Harlan's squad was tasked with securing a ridgeline overlooking a valley the regiment needed to move through. It should have been routine, but halfway up the ridge, the point man, Lester Finch from Ohio, who had just turned 19, took a round through the throat from a sniper hidden in the rocks above. He died before the medic could reach him, drowning in his own blood, while his squad mates pressed into whatever cover they could find. They stayed pinned there for 4 hours, while the platoon sergeant tried to coordinate mortar fire. But every time they tried to advance, another shot would ring out. By the time they withdrew after dark, they had accomplished nothing except losing Finch. Harlan lay in his foxhole that night, cold and angry, thinking about the mirror techniques his father had taught him for working cattle in rough country. He thought about how you could use a mirror to look around corners without exposing yourself, how you could use reflected light to scan distant terrain, how you could create false targets that would draw attention away from your actual position. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that the same principles could work for finding snipers. He spent the next 2 days scrounging materials whenever the company was not moving. A shattered bathroom mirror in a bombed-out house gave him several fragments of good glass. A bent spoon from a mess kit provided a small convex mirror that could give a wider field of view. He used wire from a destroyed fence to create a simple frame. He practiced in quiet moments, learning how to angle the mirror to see around corners and over walls without creating obvious reflections. He studied the sun's path and how light behaved at different times of day. His squad mates thought he had finally cracked under pressure. Corporal Dieter Hoffman, a baker's son from Milwaukee, who had been with Harlan since Sicily, asked him directly what the hell he was doing. Harlan tried to explain the theory, how German snipers were effective because they could observe without being observed, but what if you could turn that around? What if you could observe them without exposing yourself? And then once you knew where they were, you could kill them on your terms instead of theirs. Hoffman listened politely and then told Harlan he was insane but harmless. On November 6th, Harlan requested permission from Lieutenant Raymond Ashcroft to try an experimental approach to counter sniper operations. Ashcroft was a West Point graduate who believed deeply in doing things by the book. He told Harlan in no uncertain terms that his job was to follow orders, not to invent new tactics in the middle of a combat zone. When Harlan pressed the issue, Ashcroft made it an order. No unauthorized reconnaissance, no deviations from standard procedure, and if Harlan had a problem with that, he could face formal discipline. Harlan said he understood, but he had already made up his mind that understanding an order and following it were not always the same thing. November 7th dawned cold and clear, the kind of day that would have been beautiful back in Wyoming, but here just meant good visibility for snipers. The company was tasked with advancing through a valley to secure a village called San Pietro, a cluster of stone buildings perched on a hillside that controlled the only road suitable for moving supplies forward. Intelligence reported that German forces in the area were minimal, mostly rearguard elements, but everyone knew that minimal German forces still meant snipers. The plan called for 1st Platoon to move out at 0700 hours and secure the southern approach, while 2nd Platoon flanked from the east. It was straightforward on paper, but would become a nightmare under fire. Harlan woke before dawn and gathered his equipment, including the mirror fragments he had been working with. He told himself he was just being prepared. But he knew he was lying. He had already decided that if the opportunity presented itself, he was going to use every trick he had learned on the ranch to find those snipers before they found his friends. Hoffman noticed the mirrors in Harlan's pack and shook his head but said nothing. The advance began on schedule, with the platoon spread out in a loose formation. They moved through an olive grove where the trees stood like twisted skeletons, their branches bare and their trunks scarred by shrapnel. The ground was muddy from the recent rain, sucking at boots and making every step an effort. They reached the edge of the olive grove without incident and paused at the tree line, looking out across 200 yards of open ground that sloped upward toward the village. It was exactly the kind of killing ground that snipers loved, open and exposed with limited cover. Lieutenant Ashcroft called the squad leaders forward for a quick conference. They would advance by squads, one squad providing covering fire while another moved, standard bounding overwatch that worked well against conventional defenders but was less effective against snipers who could wait for movement and pick off individual soldiers with impunity. Harlan listened to the instructions and felt cold certainty settle into his gut. If they did this by the book, men were going to die. He made his decision in that moment. As the squad leaders dispersed, Harlan pulled Hoffman aside and told him what he was going to do. He was going to use the mirrors to locate the sniper positions before the advance started, and once he found them, he was going to either neutralize them himself or mark them so others could engage them. Hoffman stared at him like he had just announced plans to fly to Berlin. The lieutenant had given explicit orders, and disobeying those orders in combat could mean a firing squad. Harlan acknowledged that risk, but pointed out that following orders would mean watching more men die. Hoffman thought about it for maybe 10 seconds and then nodded. He told Harlan to do what he had to do, but to do it fast, because the platoon would be moving in less than 5 minutes. Harlan moved to the edge of the tree line, finding a position where a fallen tree provided both cover and a stable platform. He pulled out his largest mirror fragment and began the careful process of using it to scan the ridgeline and buildings above without exposing himself to direct observation. The technique required absolute patience, skills that came naturally from years of working cattle, but were foreign to soldiers trained to think in terms of firepower and aggression. Harlan held the mirror just above the log, angling it slowly to reflect different sections of the terrain above. He was not looking for the sniper himself, because a good sniper would be invisible from this distance, but for the things that gave snipers away despite their training. A reflection off optics, an unnatural shadow, a shape that did not quite match the surrounding terrain. The first sweep revealed nothing obvious. Harlan adjusted the angle, moving the mirror fractionally, letting his eyes unfocus slightly, the way his father had taught him. And there, just for an instant, he caught it. A glint of light from a third-story window in a building about 350 yards away. It was so brief that he almost missed it, but Harlan knew immediately what it was. That was German optics catching sunlight as the sniper scanned for targets. He held his position and waited, counting slowly to 30, and then he saw it again, same location. He had found one sniper. He marked the location mentally, noting the building's position relative to the church steeple that dominated the village skyline, and continued his sweep. The second sniper took longer to find because he was positioned lower on the hillside, partially concealed behind a stone wall. Harlan almost missed him entirely, but then he noticed something that did not fit. A section of the wall where the shadows seemed slightly wrong, darker than they should be given the sun angle. He studied it through the mirror, patient and methodical, and after 3 minutes of watching, he saw the faintest suggestion of movement, just a tiny shift in the shadow pattern that indicated something alive behind that wall. 2 snipers located, and the platoon had not even started its advance yet. Harlan memorized both positions and then did something that would either validate his theory or prove he was completely insane. He used a small hand mirror to create a brief flash of reflected sunlight aimed at the sniper position in the building's third floor. It was deliberate and obvious, the kind of reflection that would immediately catch the attention of anyone watching for movement. He knew the sniper would see it and would focus on that location, expecting that an American soldier would soon appear there. Harlan counted to 15 and then shifted position 30 feet to his left, moving along the tree line while staying in cover. He set up his mirror again and scanned the building, and this time he had no trouble spotting the sniper because the German was focused on the location where he had seen the reflection, his rifle aimed and ready, completely unaware that Harlan had moved and was now observing him from a different angle. Harlan called Hoffman over, keeping his voice low, and explained what he had found. 2 snipers, both positions marked, both currently vulnerable to counterfire if they could coordinate it properly. Hoffman studied the terrain through Harlan's mirror, saw the locations that Harlan had identified, and realized that the ranch hand's crazy mirror theory actually worked. He gathered the squad's 2 best marksmen, Privates Jerome Castellano and Wade Bricker, and told them they had targets. He gave them the positions using landmarks visible from their location, told them to wait for his signal, and then moved back to where Harlan was still watching the snipers. The rest of the squad, sensing that something was happening outside the normal chain of command, gathered closer but stayed quiet. Lieutenant Ashcroft noticed the unusual activity and came striding over, his face already showing anger. He demanded to know what Harlan thought he was doing, why the squad was not preparing to advance per the operations plan. Harlan, still watching through his mirror, told the lieutenant in a calm voice that he had located 2 German snipers and was preparing to neutralize them before the advance. Ashcroft's face went furious. He told Harlan that he had explicitly forbidden unauthorized reconnaissance, that Harlan was now facing formal charges of insubordination, and that he was to immediately cease whatever he was doing. Hoffman stepped in before the situation could deteriorate further. He told the lieutenant very respectfully that Corporal Wyeth had identified 2 sniper positions using an unconventional observation technique, that the squad had marksmen in position to engage both targets, and that if they could eliminate these threats before the advance, it would significantly reduce casualties during the crossing. Ashcroft started to respond, probably to order everyone back to the original plan, but then he hesitated. He was West Point educated and believed in doctrine, but he was also smart enough to recognize that doctrine was written by people who had never fought in these specific mountains against these specific snipers. He looked at Harlan, who was still calmly holding his mirror and watching the enemy positions, and then he looked at the open ground that his platoon was supposed to cross. The math was simple enough. If Harlan was wrong, they lost maybe 5 minutes and crossed the killing field with snipers in place, which was what would happen anyway. If Harlan was right, they eliminated the sniper threat before moving, which could save multiple lives. Ashcroft made his decision. He told Harlan he had exactly 3 minutes to prove his theory or face court-martial. Harlan barely acknowledged the lieutenant's words. He was focused entirely on the mirror and the 2 positions he had identified. The sniper in the building had shifted slightly, adjusting his aim point as he continued to watch the spot where Harlan had flashed light earlier. The sniper behind the stone wall was less visible, but Harlan could see enough shadow movement to confirm he was still in position. Both targets were stationary, confident, and completely unaware that they had been located by a ranch hand using techniques developed for finding strays in Wyoming Badlands. Harlan gave Hoffman a hand signal, waited until Hoffman had signaled both Castellano and Bricker, and then used his small hand mirror to create another brief flash aimed at the building sniper, drawing the German's attention even more firmly to that false position. The instant the sniper's focus locked on that spot, Harlan dropped the mirror and slashed his hand down in a cutting motion that Hoffman translated into the firing signal. Castellano and Bricker fired within a half-second of each other, their Springfield rifles cracking almost simultaneously. The sniper in the building jerked backward and disappeared from view. The sniper behind the wall never moved again. Both shots had found their marks, and suddenly the mathematics of the valley crossing had changed dramatically. The squad erupted in subdued celebration, men clapping Harlan on the back. Lieutenant Ashcroft stood frozen for a moment, processing the fact that this barely educated ranch hand had just accomplished something that Army doctrine said should require artillery support or airstrikes. He walked over to where Harlan was packing away his mirrors and asked a single question. How many more could he find? The advance across the valley proceeded with a precision and safety that shocked everyone involved. Harlan moved with the lead squad, using his mirrors to scan ahead continuously, identifying 3 more sniper positions before any American soldiers came into their fields of fire. In each case, he marked the position, coordinated with the squad's marksman, and eliminated the threat before it could engage. The German snipers, trained to hunt soldiers who moved predictably and exposed themselves while trying to locate threats, had no defense against someone who could observe without being observed. By the time 1st Platoon reached San Pietro, they had neutralized 5 confirmed sniper positions without taking a single casualty from sniper fire. The operation that intelligence had predicted would cost 15 to 20 casualties had been accomplished with 0 losses directly attributable to snipers. 2nd Platoon, advancing from the east using conventional tactics, lost 3 men to sniper fire and spent 4 hours pinned down. When Captain Morris Talbot, the company commander, heard about the disparity in casualties, he demanded an immediate explanation. Lieutenant Ashcroft provided a full and honest report about Harlan's unauthorized tactics and their unexpected effectiveness. Captain Talbot, a veteran of North Africa who had seen enough men die to care more about results than regulations, made a decision that would ripple through American military doctrine. He gave Harlan official permission to continue developing and employing his mirror techniques, with the caveat that he would train other soldiers in the method so that it could be distributed throughout the company. Over the next 2 weeks, Harlan became something of a celebrity within the 3rd Infantry Division. Officers and enlisted men from other companies came to observe his techniques and learn how to apply them. He taught them about angles and light, about patience and observation, about reading terrain. He showed them how to use mirror fragments for close-range observation around corners and over walls, how to use larger mirrors for long-range scanning of suspected sniper positions, how to create false targets with reflected light that would draw enemy fire and reveal positions. He explained that the key was not the mirrors themselves, but the mindset, the understanding that snipers revealed themselves through their attention, through what they watched and when they watched it. A sniper focused on a potential target was vulnerable to observation from angles they were not watching, and mirrors allowed you to exploit those angles without exposing yourself. The technique was not foolproof, but when employed properly by trained personnel, it was devastatingly effective. Statistics compiled by Division Intelligence showed that companies using Harlan's mirror techniques experienced sniper-related casualties at approximately 1/5 the rate of companies using conventional counter-sniper tactics. Put simply, soldiers using mirrors were 5 times less likely to be killed by German snipers than soldiers who relied on standard doctrine. The method was particularly effective in mountain and urban warfare, where snipers had numerous concealed positions. The success of mirror-based counter-sniper tactics created immediate demand for training throughout the division. Harlan spent December of 1944 conducting demonstration courses for soldiers from multiple regiments, teaching techniques that seemed absurdly simple in retrospect, but had never been systematically developed or deployed. Some officers were skeptical, viewing it as a lucky fluke, but the casualty statistics were undeniable. By January of 1945, mirror reconnaissance had been formally incorporated into 3rd Infantry Division standard operating procedures for mountain warfare, Field manuals were updated, training programs were modified, and Harlan found himself promoted to sergeant and assigned to divisional headquarters as an instructor and technical advisor on counter-sniper operations. It was a remarkable transformation for someone who 6 months earlier had been just another corporal in a rifle squad. The psychological impact on German snipers was perhaps even more significant than the tactical results. German snipers had operated with near impunity throughout the Italian campaign, confident in their training and positioning. The sudden appearance of American counter-sniper teams who could identify their positions and kill them with precision created a crisis of confidence. Intercepted German communications revealed that snipers were reporting difficulty maintaining concealment against American forces employing mirror observers, and some were requesting reassignment because the mountains had become too dangerous. The tactical advantage had shifted. German forces were forced to modify their defensive plans to account for American soldiers who could now hunt snipers using the sniper's own techniques of patience and concealed observation. Snipers who had once been positioned aggressively began pulling back to more concealed positions that offered less effective fields of fire. German infantry, deprived of the psychological support that snipers had been providing, became more cautious and less effective. The war in Italy ground on through winter and into spring, finally ending with German surrender on May 2, 1945. Harlan survived it all, though wounded twice, neither wound serious enough to evacuate him. He watched friends die despite his best efforts, learned that even the best tactics could not prevent all casualties. When the surrender came, he felt relief rather than joy, a bone-deep exhaustion. The Army offered him a regular commission and a position developing counter-sniper doctrine, but Harlan declined. He was discharged in September of 1945 and made his way back to Sheridan, where his father was still running cattle. He married a schoolteacher named Iris Morgenstern in 1946 and settled into a life that was deliberately ordinary. He worked the ranch, raised cattle, and rarely spoke about the war. His sons grew up knowing their father had been a soldier, but learning almost nothing about what he had actually done. He received letters occasionally from veterans who credited him with keeping them alive, men who had learned mirror techniques from him or from instructors he had trained. He read these letters carefully and filed them away without mentioning them to his family. In 1968, a historian researching innovative tactics contacted Harlan requesting an interview. Harlan politely declined, saying that what he had done was not heroic, but simply practical. The historian persisted, eventually convincing Harlan to provide a brief written account. The book, published in 1970, devoted 3 pages to mirror-based counter-sniper tactics and mentioned Harlan by name once. It was exactly the level of recognition he wanted. The true legacy of Harlan's innovation became apparent decades after the war, when military historians began seriously analyzing tactical developments that had emerged from combat experience. Mirror reconnaissance had been integrated into sniper and counter-sniper training across multiple armies. The basic principle that Harlan had intuited on a Wyoming ranch had become standard practice in urban warfare and any environment where concealed observation was critical. A study conducted by the Army's Center for Military History in 1992 identified mirror reconnaissance as one of 12 soldier-initiated tactical innovations from World War II that had permanent impact on infantry doctrine. The study estimated that mirror-based observation techniques had prevented approximately 600 American casualties during the Italian campaign and had influenced counter-sniper doctrine sufficiently to save thousands more lives in subsequent conflicts. Harlan died in 1994 at the age of 74, still living on the same ranch where he had been born, still working cattle despite his age. His funeral was attended by 7 veterans who had served with him in Italy, men in their 70s who traveled from across the country to honor someone they considered the best soldier they had ever known. They told stories that Harlan's sons had never heard, about mirrors and mountains and a ranch hand who had refused to let his friends die because doctrine was too rigid to adapt. Jerome Castellano, the marksman who had killed the sniper in the building that November morning, spoke about how Harlan had taught him to really see the battlefield instead of just looking at it. Wade Bricker read from a letter he had written to Harlan in 1946, but never sent. A letter that said simply, "You saved my life, and I never forgot it, and I never will." These testimonials revealed a man who had done something genuinely extraordinary through intelligence, creativity, and stubbornness in service of keeping other people alive. The irony was not lost on anyone who knew Harlan's story. The Army had initially forbidden his mirror tactics as unauthorized and dangerous. His commanding officer had threatened him with court-martial for disobeying orders. But that act of disobedience, that willingness to trust his own judgment over institutional authority, had saved hundreds of lives and changed military doctrine in ways that persisted for generations. The broader implications extend beyond military tactics into questions about innovation and authority. Organizations develop standard procedures because those procedures represent accumulated wisdom. But those same procedures can become obstacles when circumstances change faster than the organization can adapt. Harlan succeeded because he recognized a specific context where existing procedures were inadequate and had the courage to implement an alternative, despite explicit orders not to do so. What made Harlan unusual was not that he had a good idea, but that he implemented it despite prohibition, accepting personal risk to prove a theory. The question that his story raises is both simple and profound. How many lives could have been saved if mirror reconnaissance had been implemented earlier, if Army leadership had been more receptive to unconventional ideas from enlisted personnel? The 3rd Infantry Division lost hundreds of soldiers to sniper fire in Italy before Harlan proved there was a better way. And even after he proved it, adoption was gradual. Modern military organizations have learned from examples like Harlan's, implementing systems that encourage innovation. But the tension between standardization and adaptation remains fundamental. The value of Harlan's story is in illustrating the stakes involved when we choose between following rules and solving problems. So what do we take from the story of Harlan Wyeth, the ranch hand whose mirror trick made him 5 times more effective than German snipers? We understand that observation is the foundation of combat effectiveness, that being able to see without being seen provides asymmetric advantage. We understand that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that formal training has blind spots that can be filled by individuals with different backgrounds. We confront questions about obedience and effectiveness, about when following orders becomes a greater sin than disobeying them. Harlan broke the rules and saved lives, but he also risked chaos and undermined authority. The comfortable answer is that exceptional circumstances justify exceptional measures. But who decides what qualifies as exceptional? These are questions without perfect answers, which is precisely why Harlan's story remains relevant. He did something that was simultaneously heroic and problematic, effective and insubordinate. The invitation to you is to consider what you would have done in Harlan's position. Would you have followed orders and watched friends die according to procedure, or would you have risked everything to implement an unauthorized solution that might save lives? Comment below with your thoughts on whether Harlan made the right choice, and share this story so others can discover how one man's mirror trick became doctrine studied by armies worldwide. His story reminds us that the next innovation, the next life-saving insight, might come from someone unexpected doing something unauthorized. And our willingness to listen and adapt might determine whether those insights save lives or die as insubordination.